At my own housewarming party, my mother-in-law handed me a folder wrapped in gold ribbon and said, 40 reasons my son should divorce you. The guests laughed, thinking she was joking, and Luke laughed too, a nervous sound that tried to blend in with theirs. I stood there holding the folder, feeling every eye on me as Patricia added, "It's all in good fun. Darling, unless you're afraid to read it." I smiled because silence was easier than surrender. She hovered close enough for me to smell her perfume and whispered, "Go on. Open it." Everyone's dying to hear. The room filled with expectant murmurs. Glasses clinking. The hum of polite cruelty dressed as humor. Luke touched my arm, still laughing, and said, "Come on, babe. It's just mom being mom." I looked at him and thought, how easily a sentence like that excused everything. I opened the folder. Inside were neatly typed pages, each numbered and spaced like a report card of my supposed failures. The laughter faded as I flipped through, scanning the petty grievances too independent, too opinionated, not grateful enough. Patricia's voice cut through the air. "See? Even she finds it funny." I didn't. I found it instructive. When I reached reason number 18, I stopped. The words shifted from petty to dangerous. "A confession hiding behind arrogance," Patricia asked sweetly. "Something amusing, dear?" And Luke waited for my reaction. I closed the folder and said, "No. Something enlightening." Her smile faltered for the first time that evening, and I felt the balance of the room tilt. The folder was heavier than paper. It was proof waiting for light. 3 weeks before the party, Patricia called and said, "Sweetheart, don't worry about the housewarming. I'll handle every detail." I told her I'd already booked a caterer, but she laughed and said, "Oh, Adrienne, decor isn't your strength." The line went quiet long enough for me to hear my own breath before she added, "You'll thank me when it looks tasteful." I hung up and stared at the wall, realizing she didn't want to help, she wanted to control. That night, Luke came home cheerful and said, "Mom's excited. She's planning the whole thing." I asked if he'd told her I'd already started organizing, but he shrugged. "She loves hosting. Let her feel included." I said, "There's a difference between being included and taking over." And he smiled the way men do when they think it's safer not to answer. 2 days later, Patricia sent a group text with the guest list. 70 names long. And at the bottom I saw Melissa, Luke's ex. I showed it to him and asked, "Why is she invited?" He said, "Mom said it's no big deal. She's part of the old crowd." I said, "I'm your wife. Not part of her collection." But he was already typing a reply that started with "Sure." "Mom, when I told Maya about it over coffee," she said, "she's not planning a party. She's staging a performance." I laughed, but it wasn't funny. Patricia had turned a celebration into a stage for power. I tried convincing myself it was harmless. Yet each message from her came like a reminder that the house might be ours on paper, but hers in narrative. By the end of that week, I'd stopped suggesting ideas. Every time I opened my mouth, Luke said, "She just wants everything perfect." The word perfect followed me around the house like an echo I couldn't escape. I realized perfection, to Patricia, wasn't about beauty, it was about obedience. Diane called me on a Wednesday afternoon and said, "You need to see something." Her voice was low, the kind that makes your stomach tighten before you know why. I asked if everything was okay, and she said, "Not really. I was doing account reviews at the bank and saw a withdrawal from your joint savings, $8,000 labeled as a donation." I felt the air change around me, heavy and sharp, as if the word itself had weight. I asked, "Did Luke make it?" And Diane hesitated before saying, "No, It came from a linked access your mother-in-law still has. I didn't understand at first. Then she added, Luke added her years ago, before you were married, for emergencies. I said, Since when is her ego an emergency? Diane didn't laugh. She just whispered, I thought you'd want to know. And hung up. That evening I waited for Luke to come home. When he did, I asked if he'd checked our savings lately. He frowned, pulled out his phone, and scrolled until his face went blank. There's 8,000 missing, he said quietly. I told him I already knew and handed him the printed statement Diane had given me. Your mother made a donation in your name, I said. He blinked hard and called her immediately. I listened to his side of the call, short bursts of confusion. Then the familiar sigh of surrender. When he hung up, he said, She borrowed it for the Women's League fundraiser. She was going to pay it back. I said, Borrowing requires permission. He rubbed his face and muttered. She said it slipped her mind. I said, $8,000 doesn't slip anyone's mind. The silence between us was longer than the conversation itself. Luke finally said, Please, Adrienne, don't bring this up at the housewarming. She'll make it worse. I looked at him and said, I won't start it. Luke, but if she does, I'll finish it. He didn't respond. Just stood there, holding the paper as if numbers could rearrange themselves into something innocent. I took the statement back and folded it once. Some truths didn't need rehearsing. They just waited for the right audience. The day of the housewarming, Patricia arrived 2 hours early and said, Everything looks wonderful, Adrienne, though I did bring a few finishing touches. She gestured toward boxes labeled with her initials. And I said, It's our home, not an exhibit. She smiled like I'd made a compliment instead of a boundary. By the time the first guests arrived, every wall had her approval stamped across it in gold and white. Luke poured drinks and said, Mom really outdid herself. Didn't she? I answered. She certainly made it hers. He laughed without hearing me and went to greet someone from his office. I caught my reflection in the mirror, same face. Different territory, and wondered if anyone else noticed the name on the mortgage wasn't hers. Patricia stood near the entry, greeting people with, Welcome to Luke's beautiful home. And I realized ownership was just another thing she liked to edit. Aunt Loretta appeared beside me and whispered, She did this to me once. Years ago. Don't let her rewrite your story. I asked, What did she do? And she said, Turned every kindness into evidence she was indispensable. Before I could answer, Patricia called across the room, Loretta. You made it. I didn't think you'd come. Loretta smiled and said, Neither did I. Then leaned close to me again. Watch her. She's setting the stage. When the room filled, Patricia tapped her glass and said, Marriage is about knowing your place and laughing at yourself. The guests chuckled. The polite kind of laughter that hides discomfort. Luke smiled weakly. But I stayed silent, holding the edge of a glass until my hands steadied. She continued, To celebrate my son's new life, I prepared a little something. Someone called out, Another speech? And she waved them off. It's better than a speech, she said, pulling out a white envelope tied with ribbon. It's a list of reasons my son should divorce his wife purely for fun. The crowd laughed louder than before. Certain this was harmless. Luke glanced at me, half amused, half uncertain, and said softly, She doesn't mean anything by it. I said, I know. What he didn't know was that meaning was the one thing she never lacked. The laughter filled every corner of the room as Patricia waved the envelope like a trophy and said, It's just a little family humor. Luke chuckled beside her and added, Mom's always been dramatic. I stood still, the paper cool against my hand. and asked, "You want me to read it?" Patricia smiled sweetly and said, "Of course." "Dear, pick your favorite reason. Everyone could use a laugh." I noted it. I opened the envelope and saw pages numbered from 1 to 40. The first lines were predictable. She can't cook like a real wife should. She works too much. She moved my son too far from home. Luke leaned over my shoulder, still grinning, and said, "See, it's nothing serious." I kept turning pages, the words turning smaller as her cruelty grew sharper. Number 14 read, "She makes decisions without asking permission." Number 16 said, "She doesn't respect tradition." Patricia said, "Don't read them all. You'll spoil the fun." But I had already found number 18. It was longer than the others. A paragraph instead of a sentence. The words were exact. "She doesn't realize I used their joint account to make a donation in Luke's name to the League Fund. Proof she isn't involved enough in his life." I read it once silently, then again aloud. The laughter stopped mid-breath. Luke blinked, confused, and said, "What did you just say?" I looked up and repeated, "Reason 18. You didn't know she used our joint account." Patricia's voice rose too fast. "It was for charity. Everyone does it," I said. "Without permission?" she snapped. "It's my son's money, too." I held her eyes and said, "And mine." Eyes. Luke turned to her and asked, "Mom, did you really take money from our account?" she said. "I borrowed it for the Women's League fundraiser. You'll thank me when your name's on the donor wall." He whispered, "That was $8,000. Patricia's smile wavered. "I was going to replace it. Adrian's making this sound criminal." I said, "You wrote it down. Patricia. In your own list." "Don't." Murmurs rippled through the guests, the kind that travel faster than sound. Diane stepped forward and said, "It's true. I work at the bank. I saw the transaction." Patricia turned on her. "You had no right to look at that," Diane answered quietly. "You had no right to take it." Aunt Loretta's voice cut through the noise. "She's been doing this for years, borrowing what isn't hers." Patricia shouted, "Stay out of this." But Loretta didn't. "You took from our father's memorial fund, too. Remember?" The crowd fell silent again, the kind of silence that erases reputation. Patricia looked around, desperate, and said, "You're all overreacting. It was a misunderstanding." Luke said, "A misunderstanding doesn't come with documentation." I handed him the folded bank statement and said, "This one does." He stared at the paper as if it were something poisonous. Patricia reached for him, whispering, "Honey, you know I did this for you." "I have." Luke stepped back. "You humiliated my wife in front of everyone. And you stole from us," she said. "You're choosing her over your own mother?" I said. "He's choosing honesty." Patricia's voice cracked. "You planned this," I said. "No. You did. You typed it, numbered it, printed it, and handed it to me." "I can." Someone exhaled sharply, and the sound broke whatever spell she had left. Patricia turned toward the door, trembling, muttering, "You'll regret this," I said. "No, Patricia, you will. Because for once, everyone saw what you wrote." She froze for a second, then walked out without another word. The envelope lay open in my hand, the pages fluttering slightly. It wasn't revenge, it was evidence breathing. When the door closed behind Patricia, no one moved. Luke still held the statement like proof he hadn't wanted to see. Aunt Loretta finally said, "That woman's been overdue for truth since the 90s. And a few uneasy laughs escaped the silence. I exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours and said, "The list wasn't a joke. It was a confession. Maya found me by the table and whispered, "You didn't expose her. She did it herself," I said. "I just read what she wrote." She smiled faintly and said, "That's usually enough." Across the room, people murmured apologies that weren't theirs to give. But no one defended Patricia anymore. The air in that perfect house felt cleaner than it had all evening. Later, when the guests left, Luke sat on the couch, staring at his phone. "Everyone's texting," he said. "Aunt Ruth blocked Mom. Diane says the league board is removing her as treasurer." I said, "That was fast." He looked at me, tired, and said, "They finally saw her for who she is." I said, "Or she showed them." He didn't argue. He just nodded like a man seeing an old photograph clearly for the first time. The next morning, Diane called and said, "The withdrawal's reversible if you report it as unauthorized." I said, "I don't want to press charges." She asked, "Then what do you want?" And I said, "Boundaries." She was quiet for a moment before saying, "Then make them official." That word stayed with me long after the call ended. Luke drafted an email that night and read it aloud. "Until you return the funds and apologize to Adrian, we won't have contact," I said. "Leave out the threat, just the terms." He sent it without another word. 2 days later, the money reappeared in our account. No message. No subject line. He looked at the deposit notice and said, "She paid it back." I said, "That's not the same as sorry." He closed the laptop and said, "Maybe it's a start." For the first time since we'd moved in, the house was quiet in a way that didn't feel heavy. I walked through each room and realized silence could mean peace when it finally belonged to me. 2 months later, a cream envelope arrived with Patricia's handwriting across the front. Luke turned it over in his hands and said, "You want to open it?" I said. "It's addressed to both of us." "We should." Inside was a 2-page letter written in her slanted script. The kind of handwriting that once signed school permission slips and now confessed something heavier. She wrote about growing up with a mother who believed control was love, about losing her husband and trying to keep Luke close enough to replace the absence. She admitted that the list had been a weapon disguised as humor, that the money she took wasn't about charity but fear of losing relevance. The last line read, "I was cruel because you were everything I didn't know how to be. I'm sorry for the list, for the money, and for every word meant to make you small." I handed it back to Luke and said, "That's an apology." "Don't nist." He nodded slowly and said, "Do you want to meet her?" I said, "Only if she says it out loud." A week later, we met her at a quiet coffee shop. She looked smaller, her voice softer when she said, "I don't expect forgiveness. I only want to look you in the eye and say I'm sorry." I said, "Then start there." Patricia took a breath and repeated it, each word deliberate. "I'm sorry for the list, the withdrawal, and for turning my son's marriage into my battlefield." I said, "Honesty doesn't erase what happened, but it makes it real." She nodded, eyes wet, and asked, "May I try again?" "As family?" Luke said. "Maybe, but not the same way." Well, we sat for a while without talking. When we stood to leave, she said, "You taught me that boundaries aren't rejection. They're proof someone still believes I can do better." I said, "Then hold on to that." Outside, Luke took my hand and said, "It feels different now." I said, "It should." We finally built something she can't decorate. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. If you've ever had to draw a line with someone you still cared about, I hope you know that boundaries aren't cruelty, they're clarity. Leave a comment and tell me your thoughts. I'd love to hear your story too.